Um, so, like in Britain, in Ireland, there's a lot of nonsense talked about the European Union. There's a real campaign using the what's happening in terms of Brexit and a Tory-led negotiation process at the moment to kind of rehabilitate the European Union in the eyes of ordinary people in Ireland. And you would really have the impression from how the European Union is spoke about that it's a land of milk and honey, that it's a peace project, that it's founded on principles of democracy, of human rights, of workers' rights, etc. They go on about these things as if the European Union is this, marvelous project. And I think at times like this, when things are quite confused, as they definitely are in Ireland on this question at the moment, it's really important to remind ourselves of the basics in terms of what the European Union actually is, as opposed to what it likes to sell itself as. Um, and so, what the European Union is fundamentally is a capitalist club where the different capitalist classes in Europe have come together, have pooled a degree of sovereignty amongst themselves in order to better exploit workers within the European Union, in order to better exploit workers outside of the European Union, and in order to exploit natural resources and other things that they can gain through trade outside the European Union, and to compete more effectively with the US on the one side, China and Russia on the other side. And so to serve that purpose of that sort of capitalist club, the European Union, as it actually is, as opposed to how it likes to portray itself, is a union that is fundamentally undemocratic, that has what I refer to as authoritarian neoliberalism at its core, that is a deeply racist project, and which contains within it an imperialistic project, imperialistic internally in terms of relations between the big, most powerful states within the European Union and the peripheral states, but also externally. And linked to that is a big drive which is gathering pace for the further militarization of the European Union. In Ireland, we had the experience of the kind of austerity which was driven by the European Union, with the absolute agreement of right-wing political parties, where 64 billion euros worth of private banking debt was taken onto the shoulders of ordinary people, the debt was effectively nationalized, and for which we paid for that with massive cuts to public services, cuts to social welfare, cuts to wages, over a period of almost a decade of extremely harsh austerity. And that was driven by the European Central Bank in particular, which is an EU institution, in order to save the big French and German banks, which, if the debts weren't paid by someone, they would have gone down. A more extreme case, the most extreme case, is the case of Greece, whereby again, Greece and the Greek people were forced to pay, and are still paying, debts that are completely unsustainable in order to maintain for a period of time the European banking system. And in order to do so, Greece was plunged into, what is a humanitarian catastrophe. I visited Greece a whole number of times as an MEP, and just the levels of poverty, of misery amongst such a wide section of the population caused by Troika policies, with the EU taking the more aggressive position in that. The second point to expand on is just that point about militarization, and the imperialist character of the relations between the European Union and countries outside. So I had a particular focus when I was an MEP on trade, and the kind of trade deals that the European Union does with so-called lesser developed countries in Africa, Latin America, are really outrageous. What they have included within them is the demands for privatization, neoliberalism, as part of trade deals in order to open up markets for European big business. And then to back up that kind of policy, you have a real acceleration of the militarization of the European Union. So the establishment of the European Defence Fund, the establishment of European military headquarters, and the increase in the latest budget, 22 times increase in the European Union military budget, which is currently being negotiated. The other point is this point about Fortress Europe, because I know definitely in Britain there are Remainers who kind of portray Europe as some sort of anti-racist body, whereas in reality the European Union is fundamentally racist and has, risen the kind of, the effectively fences across the European Union, border walls, but most particularly using the Mediterranean as a massive wall to prevent migrants who are overwhelmingly fleeing the policies of war, of trade, of countries in the European Union and elsewhere, to prevent migrants from coming to Europe. And the consequence is just horrific. It's unthinkable. Is 33,000 migrants have died trying to travel to Europe in the last 24 years. And that's, those borders are militarized. Those borders increasingly are externalized. So what they do is they pay for borders to be placed in Libya, for example, to prevent migrants even from reaching the coast. They keep people in detention camps in Turkey as part of the externalization of that project, of that problem, as they see it, to push it even further away. And the final point I'll make on just characterizing the European Union is just how undemocratic it is. I mean, I was a member of the European Parliament. The European Parliament is not a parliament in any form of words that gives the word parliament any meaning. It's a democratic facade on an undemocratic project. It doesn't have the powers of a parliament. It can't introduce legislation, etc. Instead, powers rest with the European Commission, which is unelected, with the European Central Bank, which is unelected, and with the governments, which are elected but are obviously right-wing, right across the European Union. And in the course of the crisis, the European Union has got considerably less democratic and considerably more authoritarian. And that's deliberate. That's what the so-called fiscal treaty, the austerity treaty a few years ago, was about enshrining austerity in law and shifting powers from national parliaments to the European Commission, European Central Bank, to make power and decision making further away from people, to make it harder for people, to put pressure on governments not to go ahead with austerity measures. We saw in the course of the crisis elected governments in Italy and in Greece being removed by effective soft coups by the European Central Bank and replaced with governments by bankers for bankers. We saw the Greek referendum. We saw a rejection of an austerity deal. The response by the Commission President Juncker was to say that there can be no democratic choices against the treaties, i.e. against the neoliberal rules that are contained within the treaties. You can't make democratic choices against those things. And the most recent kind of episode of that is what's happening about the Italian budget at the moment, where you have a populist government in Italy with a horrific right populist racist force, the League, within that government. But they put forward a budget which doesn't comply with the kind of austerity measures that the European Commission want. And as a result, the Commission is saying, no, we don't accept your budget. And it's the first time that the kind of more hard power contained in the fiscal treaty is coming into effect, where the European Commission has the power to reject their budget, to say, even though it's voted through your parliament, we don't accept it, and to imply substantial fines on Italy or any country which doesn't do a budget like the way they want their budgets, which is full of austerity and cuts. And Italy can lose their votes, the Italian government, at the European Council, if they don't agree to comply with the austerity that the European Commission wants. And obviously, if they go down that road, the impact of that will be to create more space and support for right populism, which is seen to be, oh, they're the ones who are standing up to the European Union, they're the ones who are opposing what's taking place. They're the ones being punished, etc., because the left in many countries leaves the space free for the right populists and racists and so on to be the ones seen to oppose. So in Ireland, we campaigned for a Leave vote. Obviously, people in the north of Ireland had the right to vote, and we succeeded in winning with others the biggest public sector union in the north, NIPSA, to campaign for a Leave vote on a left and socialist basis, which is good and had a certain impact on the debate. But obviously, in general, like yourselves in England, Wales, and Scotland, the dominant voices on both the Leave and the Remain side were right-wing voices, and unfortunately Corbyn, who could have changed that and could have created a very different basis of the whole debate. Corbyn went along with that, obviously campaigned for a Remain vote, kind of a soft way, but it meant that you didn't have that clarity of a strong left-wing argument, which has created a confused situation, definitely. And in Ireland, I mean, I was listening to Tom there, like, and about how there's people who are confused and on both sides. Good working class people, good young people who are on the side of Leave or on the side of Remain. You have a divided working class. And that's the same in Ireland, in the north of Ireland, except we have the added complication of sectarianism. So in the north of Ireland, the north voted to Remain by about 56%. Within that, Catholics voted to Remain with a substantial margin, but on a low turnout because there wasn't an enthusiasm amongst working class people to Remain. But they voted to Remain because they wanted to remain, like, broadly speaking, in the European Union, which the south of Ireland is a part of. And Protestants voted to Leave by a more narrow margin than Catholics voted to Remain. So it means that there's an additional, like, sectarian division within the working class in the north on this question. In the south, because of the nature of the Tory government, how it's seen, because of the nature, like the disastrous nature of the negotiations, Brexit is seen by ordinary people, and because of how it's portrayed in the media, it's seen as this, like, right-wing crazy act by the British government. It's seen in the same ballpark as Trump and so on. That's how the average person sees what's taking place. And you know, the fundamental problem, obviously, and you must experience this a lot, is the fact that, you know, there is no representative of working class people at the negotiating table. There's no representative working class people anywhere else in Europe, and there's no representative working class people on the British side. Instead, what you have on both sides of the negotiation is what Connolly described as committees of the rich to manage the affairs of the capitalist class, and that's resulted in quite a confused situation, and a situation in the south where there are real fears of people about what Brexit will mean, about the impact on the economy, where you could have substantial job losses because of exports to Britain, and real fears about the border and the potential for an increased border either on the island of Ireland between the north and the south, or between Ireland as a whole and Britain, and that's real. And any increased border would have a real danger of inflaming sectarian tensions, where for Catholics to be cut off from the south, when at the moment you have effectively no border, would be seen, understandably, as a real step backwards from their national aspirations. And for Protestants, any increased border between Ireland and Britain would feed into a sense of them being cut off from the, you know, country that they identify with, what their identity is, and would also create a significant problem. So it's a complicated situation, that's the truth. Just finally, in terms of what we say to try and cut through that complication, to try and put a left-wing socialist position to point a way forward, the first thing we say is that the workers in Ireland, anywhere in Ireland or in Britain, must not pay any price for Brexit. So the day of the referendum result, the business association in the south came out calling for a reduction in the minimum wage because we'd have to compete with Britain. And whole sections of business see Brexit as like a pretext for going on an assault against workers' rights, saying we have to, engage in a race to the bottom. And so we say clearly workers have to take joint action to resist anything like that. There should be a conference of trade unions from Ireland, the North, from Britain, to discuss taking joint action, like we saw with joint action of Ryanair workers right across Europe very effectively. And if any companies attempt to put the cost of Brexit onto their workers through threatening redundancies, well, then we'll campaign for those companies to be taken into public ownership. The second thing to do, and what we do, is to reject the binary choice between a hard right Tory Brexit or a soft Tory right-wing Brexit, both of them representing bargain basement Brexit, as Corbyn has deemed them very well, and instead to say, well, no, there's another framework to consider what choice of Brexits there are, and that there can still be a left-wing exit, there can still be a socialist exit from the European Union, which would have a positive impact on workers all across Europe and would inspire people. And that, a Corbyn-led government implementing socialist policies would absolutely have to break from the European Union, would have to break from the single market and the customs union as currently constituted in order to implement left-wing policies and to kind of try and raise people's expectations that this can be posed. And precisely because Corbyn is the leader of the Labour Party, it isn't some very far off utopian thing. And then the third thing is to try and demonstrate how such a left-wing exit could address real concerns and fears of ordinary people in terms of the economy and in terms of the border. And I think obviously Corbyn has given off mixed messages, and people who want to interpret Corbyn in different ways interpret him in different ways. But in particular, we can point to the speech he gave in Coventry in February, where he gave an outline of how a left government could deal with the issue of the customs union, and where he effectively counterposed the existing customs union to one in the interests of working people, which could ensure no hard border, tariff-free trade, but without the neoliberal rules and restrictions which prevent nationalisation. And we say if Corbyn boldly put that position, instead of trying to appease and compromise with the Blairites, and he linked it to the need for socialist change, it would actually be enormously popular in Ireland. And it would obviously also be popular in Britain and would address those fears. And we say that the Irish government should, from the point of view of the European Council, fight for such a resolution, that it should oppose any punishment of the British people for voting for Brexit, which the European Commission wants to do to send a message to others. It should oppose any secret negotiations, that all the documents should be public. And it should argue for such a resolution whereby a customs union would be offered to Britain without the requirements of all the neoliberal rules that currently go with it. Final point is just to say that, like, if such an approach was adopted, well, then it would offer some clarity. Like, we're in a confused position because people like Corbyn, the big unions, haven't taken clear left stances, and the way out of that situation is for clear left stances and left positions to be put. If you had a negotiation like that taking place, if Corbyn used the position he could be in properly as part of those negotiations, he could argue that the debt of Ireland, of Greece, of Spain, of Portugal should be dropped. He could argue that all the fiscal rules, which, for example, prevent the Irish government from addressing the housing crisis, should be abolished, that the Maastricht Treaty criteria should go. He could call for mobilisations across Europe and put on the agenda not just the question of Britain leaving, and which will be necessary for a socialist government, but to pose the question for people about workers' governments with left socialist programmes in other parts of Europe, which in turn can pose the possibility of a very different type of Europe. And I think that's an important thing of what we have to do. We're the internationalists, they're the nationalists, and we're for a socialist Europe on a very different basis, one which has which is relations of cooperation, relations of trade on a fair and equal basis, relations of mutual assistance, based on genuine democracy, which means power is devolved to the lowest level possible, as opposed to centralized at the level of the European Commission, and on that basis to try and inspire people with the hope of and the possibility of fighting for a socialist Europe, a Europe that operates and is run by and in the interests of the millions across Europe as opposed to the millionaires. Thanks a lot.